Hi, Kirby Franze here for video for Media History 5320, and I am going to be discussing the question which is consider the concept of muckraking. What is muckraking? Is it a legitimate concept? Could modern media be considered muckrakers? Why or why not? Give specific examples from modern media. Connect your arguments back to the readings. And I'm going to break the questions up in order to answer all of those questions that are in that whole entire question. So first, I will answer the question of consider the concept of muckraking. What is muckraking? According to Britannica.com, a muckraker, any of a group of American writers identified with pre-World War I reform and expose literature. The muckrakers provided detailed, accurate journalistic accounts of the political and economic corruption and social hardships caused by the power of big business in a rapidly industrializing United States. The video posted in Module 3 also explains muckraking. That video was titled The Progressive Era, Crash Course in U.S. History. John Green explains muckraking and describes it as when mass circulation magazines realized they could make money by publicizing exposés of industrial and political abuse, and they did, which I thought was a really good video. He goes on to mention the Jungle book, and the name of that author is slipping my mind right now, even though I've seen it online while researching muckraking at least 15 times. That was a book that discussed all of the heinous conditions of the meat packing and the working conditions of the employees at the meat factories in Chicago, which resulted in the Food and Drug Act of the early 1900s, I believe, and it changed a lot. The point of the Jungle Book was to help the workers. It ended up totally grossing out pretty much all of America, most of America, anyone who read the book, which was a lot of America, and resulted in acts being passed, which is the goal of any, usually and hopefully the goal of most muckraking, is to elicit a response from the government or people who can actually make changes. And it did just that with the book, with the Jungle Book, but maybe did less for the workers, which was I think, the original intent. Moving on to what muckraking is, the name muckraker was pejorative when used by the President Teddy Roosevelt. He was not fond of muckraking. In his speech on April in 1906, he borrowed a passage from John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Process, which our book discusses, on page 326, that referred to the man with the muck rake who could look no way but downward, implying that they just look down the entire time. They're just looking for filth. They're looking for dirt. And I think that he felt that they weren't ever really trying to do anything to make anything better. And that was one of the reasons why he was so disapproving of muckraking. On page 326, our text explains that Teddy Roosevelt felt that muckraking was a derogatory, what I assessed from everything he said about it and from things that he had said in our book and online that I found, he felt it was a derogatory form of journalism due to the fact that muckrakers had attacked a senator by the name of Chauncey Depew and tried to expose him as a corrupt politician in a series published by David Graham Phillips called The Treason of the Senate. That appeared in Cosmopolitan magazine. Roosevelt thought the article had gone too far, and he sought to point this out during a dinner at the Gridiron Club, which was a dinner that was for several different old-timer journalists, and Ray Stannard Baker, during the dinner address that Teddy Roosevelt had, he was a muckraker, and he pointed out to Roosevelt that the president himself had contributed to the letting in of light and air by exposing rascals, to which Roosevelt replied, "I want to let in light and air, but I do not want to let in sewage rats." On April 14th, 1906, while the House of Representatives was being built, Roosevelt made a speech that had muckraking as the agenda, and he said, "The man who never does anything else, who never thinks or speaks or writes save of his feats with the muckrake, speedily becomes not a help to society, not an incitement to good, but one of the most potent forces of evil." And that was on page 326 as well. In other words, Roosevelt felt that if you were a journalist who did nothing but point out all the dirty realities of everything and everyone, you were one of the problems. In answering the part in this question, is muckraking a legitimate concept? Britannica.com goes on to explain that muckraker also came to take on favorable connotations of social concern and courageous exposition. Our text points out on page 327 that even so far back as the 1830s, before the progressive movement, reporters had entered prisons, asylums, and other institutions to describe conditions, but oftentimes these excursions seem to be motivated more so by captivating readers with sensational details as much as they were to expose inhumane conditions. Also, there was a fair amount of big corporation exposure of wrongdoing when it came to Charles F. Adams Jr. Our book discusses he had exposed some of the machinations of the Erie Railroad and the associated financiers as early as 1868, as seen on page 327. While newspaper reporting was not part of concerted campaigns to reform urban life, the better writers captured the plight of the disadvantaged in big impersonal cities, as our text explained on 327. Also on page 327, our text explains there were also precedents for editorial leadership on behalf of city improvement. Joseph Pulitzer campaigned in his New York World newspaper to abate the sufferings of the poor, while in Kansas City, William Rockhill Nelson in his newspaper, The Star, promoted plans to beautify the city. Our text on page 327 points out that many historians have claimed that B.O. Flowers' magazine Arena was a prototype for later muckraking magazine since 1895. It had begun publishing articles focusing on conditions in need of reform. By the end of the 19th century, Arena and magazines such as McClure's, Cosmopolitan, and Century were frequently running articles dealing with social conditions in need of reform, according to page 327. So yes, it is a legitimate concept, because yes, journalists have been using muck and uncovering the unsatisfactory and unacceptable realities of a myriad of different social situations, from political to society to corporations, since the 1800s. The concept, way before the progressive era, they've been uncovering these things. So the concept is definitely legitimate. Our text points out on page 327 the work of Jacob Riis. I might not be saying his last name right, but that is his name. One of the first photojournalists and a reporter who influenced muckrakers of the progressive area, for later on in the progressive area. In the 1880s, he photographed the filthy conditions that New York children were living in, and this caused a reform of the Mulberry district in New York, which was one of the very worst districts in New York. And mentioning the work of Jacob Riis moves me on to the next question in this question, which was, in the original question, which was, could modern media be considered muckrakers? Why or why not? Jacob Riis' work on capturing the poor, dilapidated conditions that children were living in New York reminds me of our current border situation, or I should say border crisis. Depending on the president, the press screams and cries about children in cages on the border and the depravity of the conditions on the border. However, with the current day and the change of a president recently, and the fact that the border crisis is worsening, the media falls eerily silent about our border crisis. Photographers and journalists are actually banned from the border right now. And I do believe that modern media is muckrakers, but oftentimes they give up, or they cling to the wrong things, the wrong stories. Muckraking ties into modern terms such as watchdogs, investigative journalism. These are essential forms of journalism that have changed the lives of many of the poor and forgotten. I think muckraking sounds negative and slightly condescending to a form of journalism that to me is the absolute most necessary journalism that there is. That being the investigative fact-finding journalism that we see very little of in the news today. I'm going to end there. I don't want to go over too much over the time. I appreciate you listening, and I hope you have a good night and take care.